them up, or they'd call us up. They had the privilege of calling us, collect any time that they wanted to, and they were so sentimental about home and homecoming and everything that happened at home that when we'd talk to them on the phone, they'd all cry, and we'd cry. And the day that Joe chopped a big slice off the end of his thumb, and I just picked it up and stuck it back on and tied it up quickly, and the thing really did grow back on, but that happened to be the night that they called us from Hollywood, and when I told them about Joe chopping a piece off his thumb, well, they all cried and cried about that. The whole family felt very, very close to each other. Well, one aggravation that I never have recovered over to this day. Dr. Sherman was our family doctor, and we called him to come and treat the girls. They all had a deep sore throat, the glands swollen in their necks, and when Dr. Sherman appeared, he brought a new doctor with him by the name of Dr. Reardon, and he was not. He was just graduated and starting his practice, and Dr. Sherman was going to take him in business with him as an assistant, so he brought him around on all his patient calls just to get acquainted. And so he sort of took over, and he examined the girls just like he had been invited to, and he came up with the conclusion that they all had scarlet fever. There was a slight rash on on the outside of their throats, and of course in sore throat, and these are some of the symptoms of scarlet fever. So Dr. Sherman, being the county doctor and having the authority, immediately put a big quarantine on our house. Well, in a day or two, with gargling and a little ointment on the outside of their throats and the sore glands, they were all well, and there was no such thing as scarlet fever. The little rash had been caused by being allergic to the Iodex that I had rubbed onto their shirt. So I appealed and pleaded with Dr. Sherman to take the quarantine down, because nobody could go to school and nobody could come into the house and everything. And Dr. Sherman refused. Well, we'd have to wait and see whether or not it was a mild case. And Dr. Reardon had been right, and it was a mild case of scarlet fever, and to see whether their hands and feet peeled. So we had to stay under quarantine for a solid month because of this young doctor's opinion. This was Jim Reardon, and he apologized many, many times to me. In fact, I think he even wrote me a letter. But you can imagine our wrath at being penned up there for a solid week by a doctor who wasn't even invited into the house. Mary had a bad case of scarlet fever later. This is several years later, and I don't know where in the world that she got it, but we kept her isolated in the west room, upstairs bedroom, and I had a smock outside the door that I put on every time I went into the room taking care of her. I had a basin of Lysol water that I washed my hands going in and coming out, and we kept her completely isolated, and even through all the weeks that her skin was peeling in her hands, on her hands and feet, which was characteristic. And so by keeping her isolated like this, and upstairs, no child was allowed upstairs. Nobody got the scarlet fever, but it is highly contagious, of course, but nobody got it, but Mary was the only one, and she did recover, but she had a very bad case. Mary was the one of the children whose temperature used to go way up over 102 and 3 and 4 when she was cutting her teeth even, but she was very subject to very high temperature, and she was terribly ill with the scarlet fever, and we were so afraid it would go through the family, but with the isolation and just very, very careful. I never wore the smock except when I was in the room, and I kept my hands completely, sterilized constantly. There was a time when all 5 children at once had the chicken pox at the same time. And I put up rows of cots in the upstairs front bedroom and had a regular little hospital. It was a very severe epidemic. It was as bad as smallpox is. The chicken pox were in their eyes, their ears, their noses, their throats, and all of the eruption, the itching was so terrific in the healing. Every little pus pocket had to be constantly doctored and greased, and I'd teach the children to take a piece of gauze when it was itching and just pat it instead of scratching it, because to dig at those and scratch at them would make lifetime scars on their faces, just like smallpox. But this was a long, trying siege. It was a regular epidemic, of course, when it hit our house. Imogene and Mary were both very allergic to poison ivy, and of course we would always pick it up when we went to Oak Creek, but they got it to such an extent that it would return in season, even, and finally they had to take shots for it, and after many repetitions of it, well, they finally became immune to it. But it was a great trial. When Rayma was a tiny nursing baby, she had eruption on her cheeks, and eczema, and Dr. Raymond was our doctor, and he was such a fanatic on mothers nursing their babies that he just would not let me quit nursing her, and yet at this time she was getting nothing but mother's milk. It had to be my milk. So he sent my samples of the milk into laboratories for testing, and the only thing they found was that my milk had excessive sugar, had extra sugar in it. But even so, Dr. Raymond would not recommend that I stop nursing her. He thought it was more important to keep nursing her anyway, and consequently, all through her nursing months, for 9 months, she had this terrible eczema on her cheeks, and we'd have to keep ointment on it, and kept bandages on her face and bandages on her hands, so that when she would scratch it, that it wouldn't. Even so, her cheeks show pitted marks now from constantly scratching the eczema, because it was so very, very uncomfortable. And she was so emotional that the least little aggravation, Rayma, instead of getting hurt or somebody hit her, punished her, took something away from her, if she'd start to cry, she would completely pass out, just go into a faint. And Daddy carried her in his arms so many months. The minute he got in the house, he simply carried Rayma in his arms. It's a wonder that it's remarkable that she wasn't very, very badly spoiled. One day, she quietly fainted, and we found that the safety pins in the bandage, the safety pins at the top of her head had been pinned through her skin, right on top of her head. The whole family were crying and loving her. This eczema continued for about, I guess maybe a year, until she was a year and a half, and we were able to get her on food. We started feeding her strained vegetables, peas, carrots, spinach, long before like regular babies. Usually you don't start feeding a baby for 7 or 8 months anyway, but as soon as we could get her off milk, and especially my milk, as soon as the doctor would let her off. But it was a great trial, and we were a long time getting it healed up, even after that. We might talk a little more about Mary. She had one crisis when boys were chasing her around the house, and she ran through the house, and onto the front porch, which we had just had enclosed in glass. And when she came onto the front porch, she turned around and slammed the door, the porch door closed, but instead of pushing on the door, she pushed on the pane of glass, and her hands went through, taking a great slice off her right arm, a big triangular slice, the full length of her forearm. It was a great tragic thing to have to be stitched up, and had a hard time healing because it became infected when it was a long time healing. We had another catastrophe. Between the dining room and living room was the French doors, a double door opening, and we had French doors there. And Imogene did practically the same thing of pushing the door closed with her hands on one of the panes, and her hands went through. But this glass was evidently heavier, and it cut deeply. It severed the tendons in her left hand, right at the wrist. Dr. Creighton was a new surgeon in town, and he very, very carefully sewed all those tendons together. And at that time, the girls were just learning to play violins, and we thought that Imogene's hand would be crippled, that she probably would never be able to play the violin, with her left hand. But this beautiful surgery that he did on her hand, they healed perfectly. And I think she's never had any trouble with that hand at all. But it was a miraculous surgery that he performed on it. Imogene was so concerned with housekeeping as a little girl. She was always busy helping me do all little things. And she had a tiny little broom that had been one of her Christmas presents, and she would sweep and busy with me. And so once when I was cleaning the living room, there was a fire in the fireplace, and she went over to sweep the hearth and caught the broom on fire. And in her excitement and alarm, she ran with it through the house, and Mother, after trying to catch her with the flaming broom, I was so afraid of curtains catching and all, but finally it was recovered. No, she didn't set the curtains on fire, but she came close to it, and but she did run with the flaming broom through the house. There was another time that she gave us a fright downtown. We were walking on one side of the street, across the street from Babbitt's, the east side of Babbitt's store, where the hardware store is, and right in the middle of the block, she suddenly bolted and ran across the street. A car was coming, and I had on gloves, and I remember clutching at her, and I could reach her shoulder, but I couldn't grasp her because I had leather gloves, some black leather gloves on my hands. And the car, in order to avoid her, slammed on its brake and screeched and ran clear up on the sidewalk, right up to the hardware door, and just barely escaped hitting Imogene and me both. Joe's father gave Joe a long boat trip, a cruise, clear around South America. The Charlie Babbitt boys, Paul and John, were going to take this trip, and Joe's father thought it would be good for Joe to take a nice vacation from the family. At that time, we just had the 5 little girls. Well, he hadn't been gone but a day or two on this long, it was a 2-month trip. And he hadn't been gone but a day or two when the girls began one by one coming down with whooping cough. And it was a terrible siege. We took shots. And we had a very severe case. Mary was the only one that didn't get it, but the other 4 girls were coughing day and night, whooping and coughing until they would pass out, blue in the face, and cough until they were vomiting. We got so that everybody had a big bath towel around their neck so that they could cough into it, and at night slept with it on their pillows. They could always snatch the big bath towel to to save all the beds and all their clothes from being soiled. Well, it was so severe. There was 2 solid weeks that I never even had my clothes off, and I was so exhausted, and the doctor was so in despair trying to help me that he finally said maybe if we took them down to a lower climate, that it would help. So my father and stepbrother Alvin Shuley were on the Chandler Ranch, and they were delighted when to let us come down there. And so I took all 5 of the little girls down to the ranch. It turned out to be a very happy episode, and they did get better more rapidly in that warmer climate. But I think they should be the ones to give you remembrances about how they enjoyed the farm. It was a new experience, and they got to ride the big work horses, and there was chickens and cats and dogs and baby calves and all kinds of things, with gardens and orchards and interesting neighbors. They came back with a vocabulary that would just knock you into a cocked hat, that they picked up from Uncle Alvin and some of the neighbors, because this is the kind of language they had to use on the mules. Rama, having the delicate babyhood that she did, she became such a favorite with her father. But it's an unusual thing. There never was any jealousy in the family. Rama got all the favors. Whenever we wanted any favors from Daddy or permission to do anything or go any place, always we got Rama to ask Daddy, because he could never say no to her. And by some special favor, Rama got a bicycle, the only bicycle the family ever owned. And because she was such a tomboy, she insisted when she was to get a bicycle that it be a boy's bicycle, had a bar on it. And she did share it, but there was miraculously there was never any jealousy in the family about Rama and the extra favors that she always got. But she did share it, but she was the only one in the family that ever had a bicycle. I don't know if we've talked about our big wooden coal stove that had a hot water heater on one end, and about the great big wood box that we had to keep filled all the time. I cooked on that wooden coal stove for many years. They even when the girls were teenagers and went to Immaculate Heart to school, I can remember them bringing home a guest one year, and the first thing she wanted to see was the big wooden coal stove that the family cooked on. She'd never seen one. Yes, after Daddy developed migraines, he was the first consideration in the house. And the minute that the children would come home from school, if Daddy had a migraine, this was the pastor. Daddy has a even when the girls were teenagers and went to Immaculate Heart to school, I can remember them bringing home a guest one year, and the first thing she wanted to see was the big wooden coal stove that the family cooked on. She'd never seen one. Yes, after Daddy developed migraines, he was the first consideration in the house. And the minute that the children would come home from school, if Daddy had a migraine, this was the word was passed around: Daddy has a migraine. Daddy has a migraine. Everybody had to tiptoe. Everybody had to keep quiet, and especially at the dinner table. Somehow his fragile nervous system. If anybody cried at the dinner table, Joe couldn't eat. I could just remember him turning pale and pushing his plate back away from him. So we finally established a little routine that if anybody cried at the dinner table, they had to get down and go stand in the crying closet until they could quit. And Mary was usually the one that had to go stand in the crying closet. So as soon as she'd steam up and was ready to cry, she just took herself, she never had to be told, she'd take herself away from the table, go stand in the closet. We never closed the door. It was just a crying closet in the bedroom, in my bedroom. So she'd go stand in the closet. Pretty soon she'd come back and get up the table again and be able to sit there without crying. But in order for our daddy to eat with us, we had to be extra considerate and extra careful and really pamper him as much as we possibly could. He went through years of migraine headaches until finally, when Dr. Kittredge returned from the war and set up an office near us, just around the corner, Dr. Kittredge insisted, at my request, that we have his thyroid tested, and it proved that he had the highest thyroid test in all medical history, and the cure was so simple. By taking a few drops of iodine a day, it counteracted this, and within a few short months after he started this treatment, he could eat anything, and he stopped completely having migraine headaches that he had suffered with for years. And all of these years he'd been through, we counted at 7 different clinics, and I had personally requested this doctors to please test this thyroid. I don't know why doctors don't ever want to take advice from a wife. After all, who observes her husband most and most critically? It happened that when I was young, I'd had my tonsils taken out, and I had coughed up a gland that the doctor said was an abscessed gland, and undoubtedly it was my thyroid, because any test I ever had showed that I was almost completely void of thyroid extract. And I think there's one reason that I didn't grow. I grew so slowly. I continued to grow even long after I was married. I was always small for my age. But for all these years, I have taken a little thyroid. If I ever got a little too much thyroid, I would feel this nervous, complete flighty feeling in my whole body, and my wrists I would feel them start fluttering, and I knew that this was a sign that I had too much thyroid. And I compared it to Daddy. He would come out and suddenly say, "I'm getting the heebie-jeebies." And I know that he felt just like I did when I had too much thyroid. And this is why I begged the doctors time after time. Dr. Kittredge was astounded when he found that they had never tested this thyroid. And when I think of how many years of suffering and agony they could have spared us all, the whole family and Joe and his suffering, if they had tested his thyroid the 7 years that I had begged for it. But after he was about 55, he had no more migraine headaches. He kept this thyroid balance. We'd have it tested every once in a while, and he could eat anything. He could eat chili. He never had any more sore stomach or any more thyroids. He went to Mayo's because the doctors thought he possibly had a stomach ulcer. But it was this high acid production from the thyroid. If Mayo's had tested his thyroid, then they would have solved it. But instead of that, in those days, they operated for ulcer. They couldn't absolutely prove that Daddy had an ulcer, but there was something about the x-rays that looked like, the photograph looked like it might be an ulcer, so they decided to operate. When they got in there, he did not have an ulcer. He simply had a scar on his stomach. Undoubtedly, he'd been having this super acidity for so many years that the lining of his stomach was scarred, and it looked like an ulcer. So they just took out his appendix and sewed him up. They did not take the scar out. He did not have an ulcer, and they were very honest about it, but he went clear back to Mayo's to be operated. His brother Ed had a stomach ulcer removed the year before, and so then Joe thought, well, he'd go and have his ulcer out because his stomach was ulcer. And he and Ed both had the kind of tissue that did not knit and heal, and their incision kept open, did not heal, knit together for so many months that they kept Ed there a long time, and they also kept Daddy there a long time, and he developed phlebitis in his legs in the hospital. Well, this meant that his legs had to be hung up high, he had to keep them elevated and all, and they kept him so long, and he was so discouraged that finally I got Gertrude to keep the little girls over at her house, and I went up there to be with him for a while. And I stayed at Mayo's, wheeled him in a wheelchair through the park grounds surrounding the hospitals, and then brought him home. His incision was still not healed. It took it 6 months before it finally did knit together. The year that Joe graduated from Notre Dame, Daddy and I were both we were gonna drive back for his graduation, and we bought him a little new Ford car, and we were going to drive it back and then bring Joe home with all his accumulation at college and drive back. Well, we were going to leave here about 10 days before the graduation, and about 2 days before we were to leave, Daddy suddenly told me he wasn't going to go. Well, this was a terrible blow to me because we had planned on it, and we were driving together. Well, that left me alone in the car to go back to Joe's graduation in order, to complete our plans. And I phoned and called a dozen people to see if I could get somebody who would, drive with me, but there wasn't time or anything else, and so finally I started by myself. Daddy simply refused to go. There didn't seem to be any reason in the world, but as it turned out, it must have been a premonition. I do think that what happened afterwards, I was 4 days getting to Kansas City, and when I got there, there was a telephone call for me to call home that somebody was ill, and when I called that night, they told me that Daddy had had a severe heart attack 2 days before that, or 3 days before, and that he was at that time in the Cottonwood Hospital. But evidently, the second day that I was gone, he had a severe heart attack, and he dragged himself to the telephone and called Rama, who was a practicing physician at that time, and he called her and then passed out on the floor in the breakfast room where the telephone was. Rama got over there, and she got Dr. Sitterly. Sitterly said not to move him. Rama wanted to take him out of the altitude, take him to the Cottonwood Hospital, which she finally did with an oxygen tank, and took him to, all of this undoubtedly saved his life. But even the night that I phoned, they said that the night before he had gone through a crisis, the doctors felt that he could not live, and all the children had gone down with the expectancy of simply saying goodbye to him. He was under an oxygen tank, and they, one by one, they went into the room where he was and visited with him a little bit, and he finally said to them, well, I guess you all came in to say goodbye. He was always so matter-of-fact about facing whatever God had in the store with him, for him. But while the children were there and the doctors were consulting and watching him by the minute practically, they didn't expect him to get through the night. Suddenly, one of them got excited and called him in and some miracle had happened, and this blood clot that was blocking the heart